In American society, money is a taboo topic. We're taught at a young age it's improper to talk about it, but we're also bombarded with messages about the power and importance of money in our everyday lives. And by not talking about it, we miss out on the skills and lessons we need to effectively understand and financially plan. That changes today. Welcome to Money Tales. Hosted by Sandy Brager and Cami Doder, Money Tales brings more than 35 years of combined professional experience in personal finance to demystify money and demonstrate what it's like to speak openly about personal financial matters. Join us each episode as they interview modern-day movers and shakers about how money decisions intertwine with their daily lives in order to give you better insight into productive financial conversations. Subscribe today and register for our blog Fathom at aspiriant.com/podcasts to increase your money mojo. And now, here's Cami and Sandy.
Welcome to Money Tales. This episode is about exploring unspoken expectations. What happens when your kids start worrying about money and you have no idea why? Mark Shiller is our guest this week. He and his wife have 4 children, each at that pivotal stage in their early 20s. The couple noticed an interesting trend. Their kids were stressing about money, worrying more than expected. It wasn't because of anything Mark or his wife had said or done. So where was this anxiety coming from? As Mark unpacked these unexpected fears, he stumbled upon some surprising revelations about how unspoken expectations and societal pressures can shape our financial mindsets, often in ways we don't realize. Let me tell you more about Mark. He's an attorney, speaker, and family wealth counselor who works with individuals, couples, and families on accomplishing positive wealth stewardship. Mark is also the author of the recently released book titled How to Not Ruin Your Kids with Money. It's a conversational, accessible, deep dive into managing wealth within a family. Mark makes his writing and live presentations enjoyable with the use of humor he has honed over 20 years as a professional improv comedian with Fish Sticks Comedy, a national improv comedy troupe.
Here are 3 key money topics Mark hits on in this conversation. First, how he and his wife instigate important money conversations with their children by asking bold questions. Second, why it's important to create safe space in money conversations to allow participants to open up. And third, how successful families flourish by both leaning into good patterns and behaviors that support the family's culture and by deconstructing the areas of their culture that just aren't serving them. We hope you share this episode with a friend, and please subscribe to Money Tales on your favorite podcast platform. Now on to our conversation with Mark Shiller.
Welcome to the Money Tales podcast. I'm Cami Doder.
And I'm Sandy Brager.
Sandy, I have become aware of some new trend in the dating world that I found really interesting from a Money Tales standpoint. I'm not in the dating world, but I read about it and heard about it. I hear that they want to talk numbers and they want to know very early on in relationships that the new trend is to talk about your credit score.
I have a really good friend whose now wife asked her what her credit score was on their first date.
See, this is it. Like very early on.
Very early on. It was a litmus test.
I think the idea is it's not necessarily trying to gauge wealth. It's more, I don't want to take on any liabilities. I need to understand what your situation is.
I have 2 minds about this. One is that it's kind of a nice way to find out if the person that you're going out with is aware of their credit score and knows what it means and can tell you about it. But also, the credit score was designed to help lenders decide if they're going to lend money to borrowers. It wasn't designed to help people find a compatible date. I do worry that some folks might take it a little bit too far. But I think where I land is easing into money conversations is always a good idea early on. And I advocate for that on the first date for sure. Credit scores could be a little judgmental. So maybe ease into that one a little bit.
I think there's also an app, a dating app that actually uses the credit score as the way to connect people, which is crazy.
So I have to say, people who have poor credit for a lot of different reasons. Some people can't keep up with their bills. They don't understand how the score is calculated. They might have too much credit. They might not be utilizing their credit carefully. There's a lot of people that just don't understand it and get caught in a trap. And I've seen that with some of our clients. They just were spending on their credit cards because they were racking up points and they weren't paying attention to what the credit limit was. And they weren't necessarily paying attention to when the payment was due. So they had no ill intent, but yet their score came down. I just worry that people might jump to the wrong conclusion.
Well said, Sandy. I think that's all such important reminders of what it's for. Well, let's go ahead and pivot to our guest today, Mark Shiller. Welcome to the Money Tales podcast. Tell us, what's your credit score? No, just kidding. Just kidding.
I can't just walk past this. This is such a bizarre thing to think about on a first date. It reminded me when I was a kid and dating, happily married 31 years, don't know the apps, all that kind of stuff. But when I was in high school, I bought an entertainment book, figuring they had these deals. Buy one meal at this restaurant, get another one or 50% off. So I'm thinking I can go out twice as much or have a nicer meal to share with my date. And man, I got roasted over the coals that you would pull out one of these coupon books when you go on a date.
That tells you something about your date.
Well, it wasn't the date. It was everybody around me.
Oh, fascinating. Judgment over trying to save $1.
Exactly. The other thing too, though, Sandy, you said that it's a tool of lenders. If you're worried you're going to become your date's lender, it might be a pretty good score to have on the front end.
Good point. Then there should be a whole application process involved, Mark.
Exactly.
This is going to be a lot of fun. Mark, would you introduce yourself briefly and share a couple pivotal moments that have taken place in your life, really impacting who you are today?
I've been an estate planning attorney and family wealth counselor, which is kind of a broad label, but working with families who have enough money to rub together that potentially could cause some issues, whether that's taxes or within the family or what have you. And a good chunk of the folks that I've interacted with and worked with over my career have also been business owners. And that's led to just a deeper dive and niche aspect into focusing just on the family wealth stuff, which ultimately led to a book that I just put out, which I know the two of you are aware of, called How to Not Ruin Your Kids with Money. And it's been something I've spoken on, and it's reflective of the conversations that I've had with people. There's an audio version, which turned out to be like 4.5 hours long. And I think in many ways, it could almost be looked at as, if you're going to sit down with me and talk about these things, it's very conversational. It's kind of like we're in the conference room together for about that amount of time. In terms of the moments, I don't know if I work differently or think differently than others, but I think more of stories that aren't necessarily reflective of moments in time. One of the goals of this podcast, and the two of you I know, is to normalize and facilitate money conversations. But I was thinking about a very brief conversation I had with my dad. I had finished my undergrad and my first year of a master's, and then was adding on a law degree as sort of a joint program. I had always had the expectation, I don't think ever verbalized by my parents or me, that they would pay for 4 years as best they could, and I should do whatever I can to keep the cost down. So I was an RA and an RD and took care of the room and board part of it, all this kind of stuff. I have 3 younger sisters. My dad comes up to me after he finds out I get into law school. He says, we can help, but with your sisters, we don't think we can do it all. And I said, that's okay. I've got it from here, which is the dumbest thing I've ever said in my life. But it was very much how I came out of my childhood experience, thinking this is how it should go. But an unspoken approach. Each of my sisters, I would say, took a different kind of understanding into their education experience, into their careers.
Isn't that interesting that same family, same conversations, presumably, and you approach things differently. You look at money and your obligations differently. Would you share a little bit more about growing up And when did money start having meaning to you?
My family has had different aspects. I have an uncle who's an economist. And so those conversations probably filtered in a little bit more. My grandmother on my dad's side was the one in the family who did investments. When I was a little kid, they didn't have all this stuff that's available for you to download and see what today's stock price is or whatever. So she would get these books from her brokerage firm, and it would have stock prices and history and all this sort of thing. And I remember thumbing through that and just trying to figure out, okay, what is this talking about? And so my grandmother talked a little bit about price to earnings ratios and things like that. It was interesting. My dad was an executive for most of his career at Ford Motor Company, did well there. We weren't at the highest heights of wealth, but comfortable enough. Never felt like money was in some ways a specific goal or a specific measuring stick. And so it was in some ways an object of conversation in a theoretical kind of way, but not one that was sort of a driver of identity or too much mental space.
This context that you're giving us is really interesting. I want to go back to the story that you were telling earlier about starting your graduate studies and deciding that you would pay for school. And you mentioned that there were unspoken expectations that you had, and maybe that you assumed your father had, that your sisters, it sounded like they had their own assumptions about what the expectations were. I just want to dive into that a little more because I've certainly experienced that in my life. I see it happening all the time in the lives of our clients. And that's where I think money conversations can be helpful because they allow you to set those expectations out on the table and not only look at, well, geez, what should you expect, but what shouldn't you expect? And importantly, what's expected of you? What do you think was forming your expectations as a young adult pursuing more studies and saying, hey, I'll go at this alone?
Sometimes it feels like life just happens to you. There wasn't necessarily any sort of guiding force, but if you took all of the different variables, it sort of led to that point of view. But to maybe talk a little bit about those unknown expectations that we form within ourselves. I have 4 kids, and they're all different, but they're going through a similar life stage because they're 26, 23, 21, and 20. So we've got 4 in a 6-year period there. And as you go into college, we decided that we would have a certain type of conversation with each of our kids. And we did some of that in high school. And some of this is detailed in the book. Since the writing, it's fostered some additional conversations, which is a nice thing if you've got a resource, whether that's an episode of this podcast or a book or some event. It's an opportunity to have a conversation. As we've talked to our children about how do you feel about money? Because it felt to us like they were worrying about it. I think worry is probably the right word for it, more than we gave them reason to or had any event that we could trace back. And we've talked to each of our kids about it. And I think they all said the same thing. Yeah, we don't think we got that from you and mom, but there's an aspect, I think, generationally, where there is a bit of pessimism. You know, if you look at student loan debt that people come out with, there is a sense, I'm never going to be able to pay this off, so I might as well rack up as much as I can. And then you're stuck because those things aren't just chargeable in bankruptcy, which is an insidious sort of thing that we've got to solve that problem somehow. My kids aren't going to worry about that. In fact, they've been very deliberate in their decisions about where their colleges are. We're covering things and all that kind of stuff's just fine. But then you look at decisions that people make about housing. If you don't feel like you can afford a house because of the way the pricing in the market has gone, then maybe you feel like, well, I'm not going to be able to do that, so I might as well get a nicer place to rent. And then you're not saving money to save for that first house and then build up from there. Or you think kids are too expensive. And so you get dogs and you overspend on the dogs. And all of a sudden you don't have money for kids. It's a weird cycle that people are in. And I think there is music playing in our mall of life that is impacting some of those expectations that we can't necessarily trace back to any one particular source.
Will you tell us more about your children's expression of pessimism? This doesn't just sit in the Shiller family. I feel like this is a common theme I hear and read about for this generation. What are the causes of that?
I don't know if they would say they're individually pessimistic. And I think our family has a certain level of optimism that's baked into who we are. It's in the water. It leaks in and it impacts the thinking. And so the optimism that you're raised with, or the fact that your tuition bill is covered, your room and board is covered, you don't have to worry about that not happening the next semester, which is a gift. If you feel like some of the people to your left and right are going to have these experiences, or it's almost like the shoe's going to drop and all of a sudden you don't have any specific expectation, but it's a general expectation that impacts thinking and decision making. I'm not a social psychologist. I'm not a demographic expert or anything like that. But as we're starting to have Gen Zers and young millennials coming into these conversations, whether it's through their family, having them meet with their financial advisors or their estate planning attorneys or the family office people or whatever it is, those conversations are starting to show themselves, and those attitudes seem like they're showing themselves. And there is a bit of an across the board aspect to it.
There's so much uncertainty in our world today that it's hitting so many people differently. And I'm so delighted that you're sharing these important money conversations that your family has been having with each other. I'm wondering what role you and your wife played in these conversations as you were taking this information in.
We were instigators of a lot of these conversations, and probably this one in particular, because as we had conversations with the four of them, or at least some of them, we noticed a couple of consistencies. And so it's like, okay, how do we put some words to it? How do we interact with our children on this? What does it mean? And being self-reflective, where there's some messaging that we had inadvertently passed along. So that was part of our process. And then as we start to have these conversations, I think what's helpful is you put words to things, you put them out there, and the kind of things that you don't speak about. And this is why this podcast is important and having these conversations are important, is because then you start to take away some of the power of those things that just build up, fester, and develop into their own things without any controls or any rationality to it, because the things that keep us from talking about money are usually fear, they're uncertainty, or you don't want to look like you don't know what you're doing or talking about. And so you stay quiet.
You don't want to be judged because your credit score isn't what the other person thinks.
That's right. I got dumped 3 dates in a row because I had a 630 or below. All these things I think are part of the value of having a conversation. And then you create some open space. You create open space for your children or others in your life. We as advisors, and I probably get a little bit better set up an environment for it than the two of you and your colleagues might. People tend to think, okay, I've got attorney-client privilege and I can say things. They know they have to say certain things when they get involved in the planning process. And what seems to happen is once people tell you about their financial world in a disclosing way, everything else comes out, because now you're having an authentic conversation that you might not be able to have with anybody else because of all these reasons that you and I just sort of went through, Sandy.
The magic in my professional experience and in my personal experience to these conversations is really in the questions, because I think there are ways to ask questions that will create safe space for someone to open up and share really what's most important to them, what their values are, what they're excited about, what their concerns are, without feeling like they need to say what's expected of them. So there's something about creating that environment. And I really like what you're saying, Mark, about taking the money topic, whatever it is, putting it on the table, because when you have it out there on the table, you can look at it from all different directions. You can move it around, you can pick it up.
And I would just say part of the safe space that I think comes across in conversations pretty quickly is, what's your motivation for entering into the conversations? When you have a conversation with your child, assuming you have a good relationship or enough goodwill in the family, that's going to feel safe and someone is interested in how you're doing as a person. When you enter into client conversations, and probably the more wealth, the more hesitancy there is, or the more guardedness to find that safe space, there's kind of testing and probing. Is this someone who is a safe person to talk to, even if the questions are good? And some of that, I think, comes to attitude. Are you overly impressed by money? If you don't have too much weight that you put on finances with respect to identity or self-worth, whether you do that consciously or unconsciously, I think that's a big difference. I feel like it has served me very well that I'm over myself. I've never really had a certain desire to be at a certain point on the list at the law firms that I've been at in the past, or a certain financial strata or whatever. In some ways, kind of ran the other way and capped our lifestyle on an intentional basis. Those things, I think, do help you, because then you don't get anything from being around their money. You're just there because you want to support them as a human being and as a family that's trying to live well and serve each other and serve their worlds and communities that they live in.
I'm curious, as an estate planning attorney who's having money conversations with clients all the time, how have those conversations impacted your own relationship with money?
I would probably boil a lot of it down to a feeling of the world is a big place as opposed to a small place. Having an abundance mentality, I think, has been helpful. Not all, but most of the people I've been working with have had that mentality. That's been a characteristic of the personality of my client base. The other thing, which I think is in some ways parallel, is not to have a sense of fear about money. I have a client who I just spoke with earlier this week who has a great story where basically it looked like everything was potentially going to fall apart if a certain thing didn't happen in their business, and they would have been wiped out, which is where they started from nothing. The husband in this case was the one with the business and was just stressing, and then came home one night and it's just like, well, here's where we're at. And his wife, to her credit, was like, we'll just start over if that's how it goes. That's the kind of partner you want in life. That's the kind of friends you want in life. But I think it's also the kind of attitude that will serve you well. If you don't hold money too tightly, then it doesn't control you.
Well said. Mark, let's talk about your book, your first book, with the greatest title for that category, How to Not Ruin Your Kids with Money. Wow. It's a lot of work to write a book. Tell us, what are you hoping happens with this book? What drove you to write it? And if you were to see one thing happen in this world as a result of it, what would make you the happiest?
It's about families doing well with each other. And when there isn't intentionality regarding wealth, I think the results tend to be pretty poor. If there's not authenticity to the conversations, the results tend to be poor. There are things that will just sort of leak out unless you do the hard work to speak well and in a building up kind of way to your family and the next generation. And sometimes you've got to undo and dig out patterns, behaviors, family culture, whatever, that will drive towards bad results. And you also need to enhance and lean into the kind of things that cause a family to flourish and to do well and to be whole and happy and productive and successful. So I wrote the book in part having done a lot of speaking on the topic. And at this one event in particular, there was another author who was there who we were both on the roster for speaking. And after we're done, he's like, you should write a book. I'd been thinking about it. And so then it was kind of like, well, what kind of posture to give to the book? The way I tried to write the book was to be a resource to families, to be able to take the ownership, which they need to have. You can't outsource all of this. This is a family project. You need your advisors, they're important. But if you're just trying to let the advisory team raise your family into the next generation, it's just going to fall flat because you don't care enough about it to be involved. So, how to give people some handholds, directions, thoughts, encouragement, a sense of optimism. The title sounds negative in some ways, and that would be a criticism that some in this niche, more in the family business context, but there's an optimism that is baked into it, is that if you know what you're up against, you can overcome the bad results that everybody can list 4, 5, 6. Boy, I hope my kid doesn't turn out this way. And that's what people worry about. I'm surprised the title wasn't out there before, because I think that is how people have described or even presented the issue is, how do I not ruin my kids with money? That's the question. That's what people care about. And so if you look at the primary goals, if I do anything well as an estate planning attorney, I think it's this, is to try to figure out, okay, where are people coming at from a personal point of view? What are they really concerned about? They may be concerned about tax savings, but really that's number 2, 3, 4, 6 on the list, whatever it is. Number 1 is, what kind of family, what kind of people am I leaving behind and how am I impacting them? And so if you then focus on that and then build everything off of that, then you have a way to get to a successful outcome. Now, success isn't guaranteed because ultimately everybody's got to play their part, but you definitely tilt the odds instead of being not in your favor to in your favor with these conversations, with normalizing them, with undermining the power or pull of certain unproductive, negative, dysfunctional kinds of things and attitudes. It seems like it is resonating and people are sharing it. They're sharing it with their advisors, completely unconnected to me. So that's been encouraging. It's all about those conversations and authenticity and love, care, concern for the next generations.
You talked previously how important it is to have resources to spark conversations. And I think about a book, and I think How to Not Ruin Your Kids with Money doesn't feel negative. It's got humor to it, making light of the situation. But we all know money can cause negative things that are maybe unintentional.
Taking that moment to take a pause and think through that intention that you're talking about, Mark, is so important. Tell us, what's your next money conversation going to be, and who's it going to be with?
It's going to be a season of money conversations professionally with the estate tax changes that are afoot and expected to occur on January 1st, 2026. We're not only talking about technique, we're talking about how it relates to what happens if we do X, Y, or Z, or how our primary goals would influence us to do this technique, that technique, at what level. I'm going to have one of those this afternoon. I'm going to have 2 family in-depth meetings next week and so on and so forth, at least for the next year and a half. In terms of the personal one, this is also a season when we're talking is when our kids are going back to college. One of the things that we do is we just talk about, okay, what's next? We have 2 that are getting pretty close to finishing up their undergrad. What's next? How do you think through that? And those are both life choices, but also how do you fund that? And what are the expectations? We are a family who is, like I said, optimistic, but humor is a value for us. And sarcasm has been a love language for us. Growing up, I would tell my kids, when you're 18, you're out of here. And my oldest came home from his first semester and we're sitting on the couch, TV's on, watching whatever. And he says, "Hey, Dad, can I come home this summer?" So maybe just thinking about that story, maybe I have said more than I thought. Our kids have had a strong interest in being independent. Now we're at the point where if they're going to do that, how do they do that? And what can mom and dad share about that so that we can help them get to that point? Because we're raising adults, we're not raising children. There's many ways to do this, as you both know. This is our experience. And so you only go through your kids growing up once. You can learn from others, but you also are only going to be contextualize it to your kids, each one different, and figure it out as best you can along the way. And so these conversations are front and center. It's fun because you see them growing up as part of it.
It is fun. Thanks for saying that. And Mark, before we let you go, we know you're an improv comedian.
It's my side hustle.
Do you have a favorite money joke?
Well, see, improv's different.
I know.
You got to give me a topic. I'll build a scene out.
Now I got to give you a line and then you say yes and.
Maybe at a show. Throw it out as a suggestion. We'll see what our group Fish Sticks Comedy comes up with.
Excellent. Mark, where's the best place for our listeners to find you?
You can find some information on the book and some articles that in some ways I put together in advance of the book or helped inform the book at markshiller.com. And Shiller doesn't have a C in it. That got left on Ellis Island a century or so ago. And avitaspress.com is where the book publisher is. And so you can get copies there. But all that stuff is on Amazon, et cetera. And then Twitter, LinkedIn, all the social medias.
It has been such a pleasure. You've shared so much with us, and we really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This was fun for me, too.
Thanks for listening to the Money Tales podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, share it with someone you think would benefit from listening. And leave us a review on your favorite podcasting platform. Your ratings and reviews help more people find our podcast. If you're inspired to gain clarity and peace of mind about financial matters, don't hesitate to reach out to our team at Asperient. Go to asperient.com/start a dialogue. Or you can email Sandy and me at podcasts@asperient.com. See you next time.